It's interesting. When I just said here a couple minutes ago that we need to now act as if we have unlimited resources. God was saying that to me just as much as he was saying that to you, because I was not seeing things from that perspective. And that just having those words come out of my mouth, knowing they're from God, kind of changes the way that I am looking at everything, because I was in a way holding myself back because I wasn't viewing God as my unlimited resource. And I didn't realize that until this moment, that I've been holding myself back because of that. But viewing us as having unlimited resources in God, and that we have more motivation than any other church to build the kingdom right now, that that just totally changed my whole perspective on absolutely everything.
Can I say something real quick? I feel like the
Yeah.
Lord is leading me to say this, but like as we were praying, I felt the Lord saying so strongly, when your hands are empty, you can receive what I have to give you. But if you're holding your own stuff, you don't have room to hold what I can give you. And so I think sometimes the Lord empties things.
Yeah.
And we have nothing in our hands, so we can lift up our hands and receive what it is the Lord wants to give us. But we can't if our hands are full.
Yeah. And sometimes if we don't realize that our hands are full and we don't empty them ourselves, he will empty them. And it's sometimes it's very painful, but it's necessary. So I had a sermon prepared for this morning, but when I was in my office this morning, the Lord wanted me to go a different direction. And he led me to a sermon I wrote a while back. And I actually remember getting up to preach this sermon on a Sunday, but for some reason I remember the Lord I didn't really preach all of it the way that God intended. And as I was looking over it again, now is really, it really fits now more than it did before. And so I think that's why the Lord wants me to preach on it now. But I want us to talk a little bit about Joseph this morning. Some very important things to learn from Joseph. Joseph is chapters like 37 to the end of Genesis, I believe. But at Genesis 37:1, it says, Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings in the land of Canaan. And as I was reading the story of Joseph and going through it, I couldn't help but try to get into the mind of Joseph. Because we all probably have heard the story of Joseph. There's a Broadway play about him, for goodness sakes. I haven't seen it, and I doubt Joseph was singing while he was going through everything. I don't think he was singing in prison. Maybe he was. But he certainly wasn't doing choreographed dancing. And as I was thinking about Joseph, I realized we actually have to start before Joseph. We have to start at the very beginning with his great-great-grandfather. I think it's Abraham was his great-great-grandfather. Yeah, because Isaac would have been his grandfather, and Abraham would have been his great-great-grandfather. And if you remember, I'll try to make the scriptures concise, because there's a lot of scriptures here. But if you remember in Genesis 12, the Lord called Abraham. Abraham was the very first Hebrew. There were no Hebrews. Hebrews didn't exist. Abraham was in a pagan land, and God just pulled Abraham and said, hey, go over there. And Abraham said, you got it. And Abraham was the very first Hebrew. And God said to Abraham, Genesis 12:1, go from your country and your family and your father's house to that land that I will show you. I'll make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. And then in verse 7, he says, to your offspring, I will give this whole land. So he tells Abraham, I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to give this massive land to you and your offspring. And I imagined that when God, and then obviously we know God miraculously caused Abraham's wife, Sarah, to give birth. She's very old, was not physically capable of having children anymore, but God miraculously opened her womb, and she had a Isaac, who would be the one to continue this promise after Abraham. And I imagine Isaac being a little boy and Abraham telling him of the promise of God. And maybe after that, there were several times when Isaac would go to his father Abraham and say, tell me the story again of how God visited you and gave you the promise. You know, you can imagine him coming over and over again to Abraham and saying, tell me again. I want to hear the story again of God's promise to you. And then one day, God would tell Isaac himself in Genesis 26:1. Says, now there was a famine in the land besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Gerar to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. And the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt. Dwell in the land of which I will show you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you, and I will bless you. For to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham, your father. And then I imagine when Jacob and Esau are born to Isaac, Isaac probably tells them of this great promise of God, tells them that God visited their grandfather Abraham, and then one day God visited him and told him of that same promise. And I think by the time God speaks to Isaac, I think Jacob and Esau are already adults. However, God could have spoken to Isaac before then. We just don't have it recorded. But even if he didn't, Isaac would have told all of his children about the promise to Abraham. And if Jacob knew about this promise growing up, if he had in mind all the promises that God gave to him and his offspring, that would make a lot more sense as to why wait, hold on. That would make a lot more sense. That explains why Esau would have been so upset when Jacob, I had it here, Jacob was upset when Esau stole his blessing. No, it was the other way around. That explains why Esau would have been so upset when Jacob stole his blessing. Esau did he come out first? Yeah, Esau came out first, so he was the one that was supposed to inherit the promise. But then Jacob stole the blessing. And so if Esau thought, I'm going to inherit the promise to my father and to my grandfather Abraham, if that's what Esau believed, and then his brother steals the blessing, then that explains why Esau was so angry at Jacob for stealing it. Then Jacob gets a visit from God in Genesis 28. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran, and he came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones as a pillow, and he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And the Lord said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and your offspring. So now Jacob is visited by God, just like his father and grandfather were. And now we come to Joseph. Genesis 37, verse 2. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel, Jacob, loved Joseph more than any other of his sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than them, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. So here we see some things that are pretty normal in a family, right? Joseph tattles on his brothers, which gets on their nerves. But also he was his father's favorite. And because of that, he gave Joseph a special robe. Now, just as kind of a side note here, that's not that vital to the story, but we've all kind of grown up saying that, Joseph, the coat of many colors, right? And I think that Broadway play I mentioned was called Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat or something, right? That's what we've been told. And several translations say that. However, the actual Hebrew and Greek is much more obscure than that. My favorite translation for that is actually the way that the NIV puts it, because the NIV says that Jacob gave Joseph an ornate robe. That's all it says. It could have had different colors. It could have just had different designs on it. We don't actually know what it looked like, but it was obviously very fancy. We also see from this passage in Genesis that Joseph's brothers ended up hating him. And it says that they couldn't even speak peacefully to him. They couldn't even talk to him without letting their hatred bubble up whenever they tried to talk to him. And now, as I mentioned, most likely Abraham would have told Isaac about the promise from God. Isaac would have told Jacob and Esau, and Jacob would have probably told Joseph and his brothers about this promise that God has given them, right? And those promises from God probably that was their heritage. That was the I guarantee you the backbone of the family was probably the promises from God that they would be. That was everything. That probably meant more to them than anything else could, right? And then Joseph has some dreams. Genesis 37:5, Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He says, there were sheaves in a field, and my sheaf arose and stood upright, and your sheaves bowed around my sheaf. And his brothers said to him, are you going to reign over us? Is that what this means? So they hated him even more because of his dreams. And he dreamed another dream. He said, behold, the sun, moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. And then he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you have dreamed? Shall me and your mother and your brothers bow down to you? And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. So these dreams make things worse, right? The dreams are like, hey, you guys are going to bow down to me. Isn't that great? Oh man, that was the wrong thing to say. His father, Jacob, even rebuked him. And it's like, whoa. Okay, Joseph, I know you got a nice coat, but slow down, right? So here's Joseph, okay? Put yourself in the mind of Joseph. He's grown up with stories of God's amazing promises to his family, right? Promises to bless them and keep them dwelling in this land, to protect them from their enemies, to prosper them. I mean, who wouldn't love promises like that? And not only would Joseph have heard of all these promises, but now he's had dreams where everybody's bowing down to them. And he probably is thinking to himself, those dreams are probably from God, because God spoke to my father, and then he spoke to my grandfather Isaac, and then God spoke to my great-grandfather Abraham. So that was probably God speaking to me, and I'm going to be the one that goes off and is blessed by God. I mean, that has to be what's in his mind at this point. Obviously, I can't prove that, but what else would he be thinking about? He's probably like, yes, everything is great. And on top of that, his father gives him a real nice coat that makes him feel all special and everything. And he's probably thinking, everything's going to be great. My life is going to be perfect from here on out because God is behind me, right? Joseph probably had the rest of his life outlined, right? I'm going to receive my inheritance from my father, and I'm going to live in this land for the rest of my life and experience the blessings and prosperity of God. I mean, how could my life turn out any different, right? That's probably what he's thinking. And we often do that without even realizing that. We read God's blessings and promises, and then we immediately put parameters on them and say, this is how God's promises have to come true in my life. God's promises have to come true the way that I have decided they have to come true, and nothing else can happen to me but what I think God's promises are going to happen, right? We do that. We put God's promises in a box and say, this is what God's going to do for me, and nothing else can happen but what I think God is saying to me, right? And then something happens to Joseph that is worse than a nightmare. One day his brothers walk towards him, and I can imagine them coming towards him, and just like every other day. But this time, they grab him and rip the coat off his back. And you can just imagine the confusion, right? Like, hey, Dad gave me that. What are you doing? And then they probably start beating him up, and then they start dragging him to this pit. And he's like, what are you doing? Stop! What are you doing? And they throw him in a pit. And he probably is like, you have no idea who you're touching. And he's probably thinking, that's it. When I get out of here, you guys are in trouble. That's probably what he's thinking. I mean, he's probably really angry, really confused, but he's like, you guys aren't going to get away with this. Wait till I tell Dad what you guys have done. His brothers actually wanted to kill him. But in verses 25 through 28 of Genesis 37, one of his brothers said, no, let's not kill him. Let's just sell him. right? Let's not actually kill him. If that hadn't happened, it said, then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit, and they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. And you just imagine this. Joseph is in the promised land. God has promised him this. And all of a sudden, he starts being dragged away from the promised land. So you think his whole life he's thought, this is going to be great. This is my inheritance. This is great. But now he's being pulled away from it. And all of a sudden, all those promises of God, all of his dreams are just a distant memory, because the farther he's being pulled away, the smaller and smaller the promised land looks as he's being pulled away from it. I can only imagine him thinking, like, this can't be happening. God promised blessing, and he promised prosperity in this land. How can I be taken away from this land? This shouldn't be happening to me. This something is wrong here. I thought God would never allow this to happen to me. He promised me this land. How can he let something like this happen to me? Somehow in Joseph's situation, he probably thought that the only conclusion now is that he's been cursed by God. He's cursed because God is not fulfilling his promises anymore, so now he thinks that he's cursed. Isn't that how we think sometimes? We create our own parameters for God's blessings. And we assume blessing and promise from God equals physical, worldly pleasure and delight. That's what we think. That's exactly what we think. And so anything negative or painful can never be from God. Oh, that's the devil. Anything that hurts, that's the devil. That's always the devil, because God has promised you everything will be wonderful all the time. So anything that bad happens, it's the devil. Maybe the problem is sometimes we have no idea what God's blessings really are. Maybe that's the problem. Listen to what God says about the Apostle Paul. In Acts 9, when he calls Paul and he's talking to Ananias, he says, the Lord said to Ananias, who was afraid of Paul, he said, go, for Paul is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for my name. It doesn't sound like God. I'm going to show Paul he's going to have to suffer for my name. No, God doesn't. No, that's not. No, that's Satan. Satan's behind the suffering. Satan's behind the negative things, right? Not God. God could never possibly have any use for that. Well, that's not what the Bible says. That's just not what the Bible says. Genesis 37 again, verse 31. Then they took Joseph's robe and they slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father. And they said, we found this. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not. And he identified it and said, it is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without a doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his body, and he mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, no, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him. So Jacob's like, no, I just want to die. I just want to die. I just want to die. I don't care about anything anymore. See, when these situations happen, these bad situations happen to us, they don't just affect us, they affect everybody around us. They affect everybody. But God would never let that kind of stuff happen to his children, would he? He wouldn't let anything bad happen to any of us, right? Verse 36 of Genesis 37, meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, who was an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Now, this brings to chapter 38 of Genesis, which is not about Joseph at all. Nothing to do with Joseph. I don't know why there's a chapter in between Joseph's story. I don't know why God did that, but anyway. And then it appears in chapter 39 that things have gotten better for Joseph, right? It looks like things are up, right? He's a servant in Potiphar's house who is a high official in Egypt. Perhaps Joseph started to get a little hope back, right? We're told that Potiphar liked Joseph and he honored him and he gave him promotions. So finally, God's blessings are back because with God, it's nothing but promotions and money and health, right? And so God's back. Joseph somehow got God back on his side. He must have done enough good things. I don't know, right? And then Genesis 39, verse 6. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's charge. And because of him, he had no concern about anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And after a time, Potiphar's wife began to cast eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me, sleep with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in his house, and he's put everything in my authority. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. Notice what Joseph says. Nobody's around, just Joseph, Potiphar's wife. Joseph says, how can I do this great wickedness against God? Joseph knew God was there just as much as anybody else. And just because he could have gotten away with it doesn't mean anything, because to him, sin, first and foremost, is about God. And he wasn't dare going to sin against God. And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her or to be with her. So we see Joseph seeking to honor and obey God and his master. And I'm sure Joseph is thinking, as long as I stay faithful to God, nothing bad is going to happen again. And then eventually I'll be able to go back home. I'm just going to keep my eyes forward, and that's it. I'm not going to do anything else, right? However, Potiphar's wife would not take no for an answer. And to summarize, Joseph did the only thing you can do in that situation. He ran away. Man, I tell you what, I've heard certain guys say, "Oh, I have willpower. I don't give in to anything." You moron. Yeah, sure. If you're in this situation, there's only one course of action: run like you're Forrest Gump away as fast as you can. But Potiphar's wife grabbed his coat as he was running away and held on to it. And then decided that she was going to falsely accuse him of sexual assault. Like, well, if he's not going to listen to me, then I'm going to punish him for it. And then verse 19 of Genesis 39, as soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, this is the way your servant treated me, his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. Can you imagine his mind? God, why'd you let this happen, God? I'm innocent. I didn't do anything wrong, Lord. I did what you told me to do. I did what I should do, and I ran away from sin. I only tried to obey you, and I'm in prison now. First being sold into slavery, now I'm in prison. Man, you can imagine. He's probably thinking, why do sinful people get away with so much? Why do the people that do the wrong things get away with it, and the innocent ones are always the ones that are punished? And he's probably thinking, God, you promised my family we'd be in the promised land. How can you let this happen to me? And while Joseph's in prison, he interprets some dreams of a baker and a cupbearer, and they get out of prison. And he says, hey, put in a good word for me to Pharaoh, right? I helped you guys, right? However, they forgot Joseph. They forgot to tell Pharaoh that Joseph helped them. 2 years go by, right? And if we fast forward the story here, it's a big story. Pharaoh had a dream he couldn't understand, and the cupbearer all of a sudden remembered, oh, there was this guy in prison that I was about to make a prison joke, and I thought, nope, not the right time or place. But he remembered Joseph, and he remembered Joseph interpreted my dream, actually. He could probably help you. Pharaoh then talks to Joseph, who tells him the dream. Basically, bottom line, the entire land would have 7 years of plentiful bounty of crops, and then it would have 7 years of no food at all. And Joseph says, okay, what you need to do is for the next 7 years of plenty, you need to store up 7 years worth of food. So when the 7 years of famine come by, you have food for those 7 years, basically. And then Pharaoh says, you know what, Joseph, I like how you did that. You're a second in command of everything, which seems a little weird to think about it. I mean, that's all he had to do for a promotion like that. It was just, tell us the dream, but anyway. And so Joseph is now second in command of all of Egypt. The only person above Joseph is Pharaoh himself. He's the head of, he's over everybody, and he's not even Egyptian. And then at some point later on, Joseph, of course, gets married, has children of his own. At this point, I don't know what Joseph would be thinking. I don't know if he was still thinking about God's promise, or if he was just like, well, maybe this is what God's promise meant. Maybe I'm supposed to be here in Egypt, and maybe he just went with it. And I don't know. It'd be interesting to figure out what's going on in his mind. But Joseph's brothers come, and he, instead of revealing himself, he kind of toys with them a little bit and tests them in Genesis 43, 44. If you haven't read that, you should, it's very interesting. I wonder why he decided to do that instead of just revealing himself. But anyway, he basically wants his youngest brother, Benjamin, to be brought to him, and, different things happen. And he basically is going to keep Benjamin there overall. In Genesis 44:30, one of his brothers says, "Therefore, as soon as I come to your servant, my father, and his youngest son is not with us, his life is bound up in the boy's life. As soon as he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die. And your servants will bring down the gray hairs of your servant, our father, with sorrow to Sheol. For your servant became a pledge of safety for the boy to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, I shall bear the blame before my father all my life. Now, therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the boy as a servant to my Lord, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the evil that would find my father." So they said, no, don't keep our youngest brother. Joseph, they don't know he's Joseph. Keep me instead. Let our youngest brother go back to our father, because if our youngest brother, he already lost his first youngest. If he loses the other youngest, he's going to die. Please don't do that to him. And then finally, Genesis 45, verse 1, Joseph could control himself, could no longer control himself. And he cried, "Make everybody leave the room." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. They were shocked. Excuse me. And all of a sudden, in this very moment, Joseph understands exactly what God has been doing. All those years of confusion, finally, Joseph gets it. Verse 4. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near, please." And they came near. And Joseph said, "I am your brother Joseph that you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because that you sold me here. For God sent me here before you to save lives." Think about that. Of everything that happened, Joseph said, God sent me here. This was God the whole time to save everybody's life. If Joseph hadn't gone to Egypt, what would have happened? There would have been a 7-year famine. The Egyptians would have died. The Israelites would have died. Everybody would have been dead, and none of God's promises would have ever come true. And all of a sudden, it hits Joseph. This was God the whole time. Those nights in prison when I thought God hated me, no. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years more to go. And God sent me before you to preserve a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you that sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and the Lord of his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. We need to understand something. Most of the time, our suffering ends up being a blessing. Your suffering, most of the time, it's not all the time if you're a believer, your suffering is a blessing. And more often than not, your suffering is a blessing to other people. Sometimes your suffering is the one thing that's going to save somebody's soul. We need to realize that. There's no such thing as wasted suffering. Nothing ever happens in your life where God just goes, whoopsie. That doesn't ever happen. God's not that stupid. He knows exactly what he's doing, and he doesn't let anything go by him unless there's a purpose to it. No pain happens unless there's purpose in that pain. And so often, the purpose might not even be for us. It might be for other people around us. You have to remember that. Because that's the only way you can get through suffering, is to remember that there's a purpose behind it. And here's the thing. If Joseph kept his eyes and ears open, he would have realized the whole time God was in everything. If we go back to Genesis 39, when Joseph is sold to Potiphar, you know what verse 2 says? The Lord was with Joseph. God didn't go anywhere. When Joseph's in prison, verse 21, the Lord was with Joseph. Even in prison, God was there the whole time. God is there the whole time. We go through suffering and we're confused and everything, and we don't realize God's right there. He's right there. You think Daniel was, we know the story of Daniel in the lion's den? Oh, how did those lions not eat Daniel? Because Daniel wasn't the only person in the lion's den. God was right there with him, and those lions knew it. And they didn't touch Daniel. But the Lord was with Joseph in prison and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And then finally, verse 50 of Genesis, chapter 50. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, so eventually Jacob came, great reunion, he died. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph now is going to hate us and will pay us back for all the evil we did to him. So they're thinking it's only a matter of time when he's going to let the... And boy, if Joseph wanted his brothers tortured and killed, he could have done it like that. He could have done anything he wanted to them. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers. Do you think... I think they're lying again. I don't think Jacob said anything. Joseph, Jacob, before he died, he mentioned you should leave us alone. Just want to throw that out there. Like, they're terrified, right? Please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. Now, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph wept, and they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said, fear not, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. God is so wise that he can take people's evil, sinful actions and let them happen, but he can grab them and make them work for our benefit. It's amazing. You ever wonder when Paul says we are more than conquerors? You ever wonder what that means? What's a conqueror? A conqueror is somebody you conquer, right? You see an enemy territory and you conquer it, you defeat their army, you take over everything. You're a conqueror. How do you be more than a conqueror? Well, probably the only way to be more than a conqueror is to take the very thing you've conquered and make it work for you and serve you. So when Paul says we're more than conquerors, we don't just conquer sin, but sin now becomes our servant. And even the evil things that other people do come to work for our benefit. That's what God does for his people. And Joseph knew that. And when his brothers were talking, he said, how can I hurt you? This was God's plan all along. How can I be mad at you for God's plan? You might have thought evil in what you did, but God's plan the whole time was good. So as we close this morning, God wants us to understand that our suffering usually is always a blessing. Blessing for us, blessing for others around us, and that God is in charge of all of it. There's a theologian one time that says, there is no part of the universe that Jesus doesn't point to and say, mine. Everything is his. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians, because everything is his, he says, everything is yours. Life, death, everything is yours because we are his children. So as we close with prayer, let's just ask the Lord to help us to understand that he's with us in everything, and that the things that hurt the most oftentimes produce the biggest blessings in our lives. So